Hello, this is Jacqueline from Jack Knits, and let's talk today about a knitting gauge. What is it exactly? Is it really important to do for all of your projects, and what to do with the results of your knitting gauge swatch? So let's dive right in. All right, so let's be honest. Knitting a knitting gauge swatch is often a very tedious task. None of us really like to do it because we just want to dive right into our project and not waste that time knitting a swatch. But let's talk about why knitting gauges swatches are so important and what you can do with the results of a knitting gauge swatch. So I know we don't like to spend a lot of time doing the swatches, but here's why it's important, and here is when it's not so important. So basically what a knitting gauge is, first of all, is the pattern designer's way of telling you what size of finished project you can expect to receive if you knit the pattern according to their specifications. So if the designer says, I knitted this sweater, let's say, with a worsted weight yarn, a size 8 needle, and with my knitting style, my tension, I was able to get so many stitches in a 4-inch swatch and so many rows within a 4-inch swatch of fabric. Now, if you knit a same piece of 4x4-inch swatch fabric and you get the same number of stitches and rows as I did, the designer, then your knitted piece will turn out the same size as I have, which is great. So when you're knitting that small size sweater, you can expect to finish with a small size sweater. If your knitting gauge is not the same, so let's say you got more or less stitches in that 4x4 swatch, then you need to make some adjustments so your knitted piece will fit at the end. So when is it important? Well, it's obviously important when you're knitting a piece where size is important, like any type of a fitted garment, like a sweater, for instance. You certainly want to do a knitting gauge for that because you do not want your sweater to end up being way too large or way too small. Even for smaller items like a hat, you want it to fit nice and snugly on your head. You do not want it to be too large or too small. A knitting gauge is important for that as well. When is it not important? Of course, for anything that size doesn't really matter, like a blanket for say. It doesn't matter if your blanket ends up to be 1 inch wider than the designer's. It's still going to be a lovely blanket. It doesn't matter. Or a scarf, or anything that size is not really important. You can skip the knitting gauge step completely for that. But when it's a fitted garment, you're going to want to do a knitting gauge. Okay, so let's take a look at a knitting swatch and determine how we can make adjustments to it if our knitting gauge is slightly different than the designer's. So let's pretend that our designer for this particular pattern indicates that their gauge and it might be written somewhat like this. It would say gauge 4x4, and then it would tell you the stitch that they're getting this gauge in. So they're saying for a stockinette stitch, for a 4x4-inch swatch, I was able to get 17 stitches within those 4 inches and 23 rows within that swatch. So now your job, and they're also indicating, what yarn they've used. So they've used a worsted weight yarn, let's say, and a size 7 needle. So you would now take your worsted weight yarn that you've picked out for the project and your size 7 needle that you have, and you would knit up a swatch similar to something like this. And you are now going to determine, when I'm done with the swatch, am I going to come up with the same 17 stitches and 23 rows as the designer did. So here I've knitted a swatch already with that worsted weight yarn, that size 7 needle, and let's determine what I've gotten for this. Now you can do this in a couple different ways. You can use a simple measuring device like this. You don't have to necessarily count all 4 inches. You can count 2 and double it. You want to make sure it's laying nice and flat and you've got this lined up nicely here. Or you can use this really wonderful tool, this knitting gauge or knitting size tool that has a swatch little square in it. And this is perfect for this because you can lay it right on top of your knitting. And it's got this little 2-inch by 2-inch spot here, and you can lay it right on top of your knitting here and very clearly count your stitches. So here I've in my 2-inch spot here, I'm going to count how many stitches I have across and how many rows I have up. So across, and you want to make sure you're right on the edges of your stitches. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stitches within that 2-inch swatch, which means that I have 16 stitches, one less than the designers. Now let's check my rows here. So let's line this up again and let's see how many rows I get. So I will count 1, 2, and I'm counting my V's in my stacking net stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 for 2 inches times 2 because we're doing a 4-inch swatch. So I've got 22 rows. So that means that my stitching or my tension is a little bit bigger, right, than the designers, because the designer got 17 stitches in that 4-inch swatch and I only got 16. So that's telling me that my stitches are a little bit bigger because of my style of knitting. I must knit a little looser than the designer. I only got 16 where she got 17. So what can you do to make your 16 become 17? I need to make my stitches tighter, right? I need to fit one more stitch within that swatch. The easiest way to make tighter stitches, right, is to go down a knitting needle size. So if the designer is calling for a size 7 needle, so let's knit that same swatch with a 6 size needle and see what we come up with in that regard. Okay, so then you would knit another swatch with a size 6 needle and do the same thing. Count how many stitches in your block, how many rows, and hopefully you come up with a little bit closer to 17. Now here, let me just remind you, when you are counting your stitches, if we happen to have a nice even number of stitches in this 2-inch, but if you come up with a half a stitch, like let's say this ending of your 2-inch was right in the middle of a stitch, be sure you count that half a stitch because that makes a difference in the long run, a half a stitch. So just make sure that you're counting exactly how many stitches you have in your stitches and in your rows. Now the other way is true is also if the knitting gauge indicated 17 stitches and I was only getting, or I was getting 18 or 19 stitches, I was getting too many, that of course means that my stitches are smaller than the designer and I need to make my stitches bigger, and that means going up a needle size, right? So either way, you want to make an adjustment, do another swatch and see if you're any closer to the knitting gauge, and that will help you make your size, your fitted garment the proper size, right? Okay, so let's talk about knitting in the round. Is that any different from knitting flat, and does that affect the way you do a knitting gauge? Well, the answer to that question is actually yes. When you are knitting, let's look at the swatch again. When you're knitting flat, you are knitting one side knitted and the other side you are purling, right? So you're constantly flipping your knitting from knitting one side, purling the other. But when you're knitting in the round, you are not doing that. You are knitting every single row. And that can affect the size of your knitting gauge because often knitters knit their knit stitches a slightly different tension than their purl stitches. I, for one, and I think a lot of knitters, tend to knit their purl stitches a little bit tighter than your knit stitches. So if you're never purling any stitches, your knitting gauge might be a little bit looser than knitting it flat. So it is a good idea to knit a knitted round piece to do your gauge. Now you right away say, ugh, that's gonna take a while to knit a whole round piece, big enough for a knitted swatch. But let me show you a little tip that you can do to not spend all that time knitting a big piece in the round just to get a knitting gauge. What you can do, let me show you on this swatch, you can knit a knitted flat piece and mimic what that will look like if you knit it in the round. And that means if I knitted every single row. So what we can do here, I've knitted the swatch and I've knitted to the end of one row, and you have to use double pointed needles for this because after I'm done knitting with this row, I'm going to slide it to the other end of my knitting and just carry this your working yarn to the back of your swatch very loosely, You can see how I'm doing that on the other swatches, and just simply start knitting on the other side. Switch it to my other hand here and knit back the way that you came. So in a sense, you are not purling at all, you are just knitting every row, and in that sense it mimics your knitting tension that you would be doing if you knitted in the round and you're knitting every single round. So let's knit to the end of this round, or this row, and then I'll show you what you can do at the end to get your accurate count. Okay, so when you're not done with that, then of course you would again slide it to the other end, bring that to the back, and knit the next row. So when you have a piece large enough to determine a knitting gauge, you're going to want to flip it upside down and then cut these strands on the back. I'll grab my scissors here, because you do not want to have these out there, because you can see that it might tend to pull it in. So just snip these strands from the back of your knitting. So now you can lay it nice and flat. You might want to bind off too first. Lay it nice and flat, and now you've got a perfect knitting gauge to do that mimics knitting in the round. So I would suggest to do that if you are knitting like a hat, it's in the round, and you want to make sure that your gauge is correct. Do this little trick to make sure that you're getting the right tension for your knitting gauge. All right, well, I hope that gives you some indication of and knowledge on knitting gauges and when you can skip the process and when you can't. Now, if you talk with some knitters that are really passionate about knitting gauges and want to make sure that they're doing it correctly, they may often tell you that you also should block your knitting gauge before you do your count, because blocking will relax the knitting stitches and you might get a slightly different count. Now, personally, I am much too impatient for that, to block it and wait for it to dry before I do my gauge, because again, like most of you, I want to get right onto my project. So I have never done that. I've never had any problem with my knitting gauges and coming up with an accurate count without blocking. But if you are a stickler and you want to do it perfectly and make sure that you've got the right count, then by all means block your knitting gauge or swatch before you do your count. So I hope you found this helpful and you've learned a little bit about knitting gauge, and your knitted projects will come out the correct size, and leave all that frustration aside, because we know that it is much more frustrating to end up with a knitting piece that is the wrong size than it is to spend just a few extra minutes at the start of your project doing a gauge. So if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to receive notifications about upcoming knitting videos and tips and tutorials and fun stitches and creative patterns. And give me a thumbs up if you like this video as well. Thanks so much for watching. Happy knitting.